Harlem in the late 1930s was more than a neighborhood, it was a kingdom with invisible borders and unwritten laws. Music poured from clubs long after midnight, numbers runners slipped through crowds with coded slips in their pockets, and every block had someone watching who didn't look like they were watching at all. Outsiders saw noise and chaos. Insiders knew better. Harlem ran on structure, discipline, and balance. At the center of that balance stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't rule Harlem the way other gangsters ruled their territories. There were no public executions, no reckless gunfire echoing down Lenox Avenue. Violence existed, but it was rare, and when it happened, it was purposeful. Bumpy understood something most criminals never learned: disorder attracted attention, and attention attracted ruin. Harlem thrived because it was calm. That calm made people nervous. Especially the Italian Mafia. New York City, in those years, was a chessboard controlled largely by men like Lucky Luciano. The Italians ran gambling, bootlegging, unions, docks, entire industries greased by corruption and protected by influence. They were used to owning neighborhoods outright or squeezing them until submission followed. Harlem refused to submit. Not because it couldn't be taken, but because taking it would cost too much. Bumpy Johnson was educated, strategic, and deeply connected. He spoke with politicians the same way he spoke with street soldiers, directly, intelligently, and without fear. He read philosophy in prison. He quoted poetry in conversation. And when it came to business, he understood leverage better than most men wearing tailored suits downtown. The Mafia tolerated Bumpy at first. He was useful. He kept Harlem orderly, profitable, and predictable. Money flowed upward without constant headaches. That arrangement worked until Bumpy's influence grew beyond what Luciano considered acceptable. Bumpy wasn't just collecting and distributing. He was negotiating. Deciding terms. Saying no. That was the problem. In a city built on hierarchy, a black man who refused to bow was more than an irritation, it was a challenge. Not loud enough to start a war, but serious enough to demand a response. Luciano didn't want Harlem destroyed. He wanted it reminded of its place. So he chose intimidation. Not bullets in the street. Not arrests. Not betrayal. A meeting. Because meetings were where power was measured. Word traveled quietly that Luciano wanted to talk. Neutral ground. No witnesses. No press. The kind of invitation that sounded polite but carried a threat underneath. Men understood what it meant when you were summoned by the Mafia. You came prepared to lose something: money, territory, dignity, or your life. Bumpy Johnson came anyway. And he came alone. That decision alone told the story of who he was. Harlem didn't follow Bumpy because he was the most violent man in the room. They followed him because he never needed to be. He trusted his mind more than muscle, his patience more than fear. As he walked into that meeting, Harlem didn't hold its breath. It trusted him. What Lucky Luciano didn't yet understand was this. Harlem wasn't standing because the Mafia allowed it. It was standing because Bumpy Johnson had decided it would. The building chosen for the meeting sat just far enough from Harlem to feel deliberate. Not hostile territory, but not safe either. Neutral ground, the kind that belonged to whoever brought the most confidence into the room. Its windows were narrow, its hallways quiet, and the air inside carried the stale smell of old smoke and power that had passed through too many hands. Bumpy Johnson arrived on time. He wore a dark suit, pressed and understated, the kind that didn't beg for attention. No jewelry. No visible weapon. No entourage. To the men watching from inside, that alone was unsettling. Most bosses never walked into uncertainty alone. Alone meant vulnerable. Or fearless. Lucky Luciano was already seated when Bumpy entered. Relaxed. Comfortable. A man used to rooms bending to him. Around him stood 4 of his men, well-dressed, alert, hands resting just a little too close to their jackets. These weren't impulsive street soldiers. They were professionals. Enforcers who knew exactly how much pressure to apply without spilling blood. The door closed behind Bumpy with a dull finality. No greetings followed. For a moment, the room stayed quiet, heavy, expectant. Luciano studied Bumpy the way a gambler studies a table, measuring odds, looking for tells. He expected tension. Perhaps defiance. Maybe fear masked as pride. He got none of it. Bumpy stood calmly, eyes level, posture relaxed. He didn't rush to sit. He didn't wait to be invited. He took his time, choosing a chair across from Luciano and sitting down as if this were just another business discussion. That annoyed Luciano more than anything else. One of the men spoke first, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Lucky wants to remind you who really runs New York. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of an empire behind them. Bumpy looked at the man, then back to Luciano. He said nothing. That was the signal. The guns came out smoothly, almost elegantly. 4 pistols, raised but not aimed directly yet. A silent threat, precise and controlled. This wasn't about killing Bumpy Johnson. Not yet. This was about watching him react. Men cracked in moments like this. They pleaded. They blustered. They reached for something they shouldn't. Any one of those reactions would have ended the meeting violently. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply looked at Luciano, calm and steady, as if guns had no more effect on him than rain on pavement. That calm unsettled the room. Luciano leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. He had expected resistance, maybe arrogance, but not this level of composure. The men with guns felt it too. Their fingers tightened, not because they wanted to fire, but because they didn't understand what they were looking at. Bumpy Johnson was not intimidated. He wasn't pretending. And that introduced a new, dangerous variable into the room. Because intimidation only works when the other man believes you need it. And as the seconds passed in silence, it became clear to everyone present that Bumpy Johnson didn't. The guns were out. The message had been delivered. Now the room waited to see what Bumpy Johnson would do next, unaware that the balance of power was already beginning to shift, quietly, irreversibly, away from the men holding the weapons. In moments like these, history usually turns on panic. A twitch. A raised voice. A hand moving too fast. That's how empires collapse. But Bumpy Johnson understood something the men with guns did not. Power was psychological long before it was physical. And right now, every man in that room expected him to react like prey. He didn't. Bumpy leaned back slightly in his chair, not enough to seem dismissive, just enough to show comfort. The movement was subtle, but it landed harder than a threat. One of the gunmen swallowed. Another shifted his footing. They had practiced dominance their whole lives, yet this man, unarmed and alone, was erasing it without effort. Then Bumpy reached into his coat. The change in the room was immediate. Muscles tightened. Triggers flexed. Breaths stopped. This was it, they thought. The moment where instinct would justify gunfire. But Bumpy's hand moved slowly, painfully slow, never breaking eye contact with Lucky Luciano. He withdrew not a weapon, but a folded piece of paper. Plain. Unmarked. Almost insulting in its simplicity. He placed it gently on the table. No slam. No flourish. Just certainty. Luciano didn't touch it at first. He watched Bumpy's face, searching for bluff, for desperation, for any crack in the calm. He found none. Bumpy's eyes held steady, not defiant, not submissive. Informative. Finally, Luciano nodded to one of his men. The man stepped forward, gun still raised, and opened the paper. His expression changed instantly. The room felt colder. Printed across the page were names, important ones. Judges. Dock officials. Union contacts. Police captains. Alongside them were routes, dates, figures. Details only insiders knew. The invisible skeleton of Luciano's operation, laid bare in ink. This wasn't rumor. This wasn't leverage gathered overnight. This was knowledge collected patiently, over years. Luciano's jaw tightened. Bumpy spoke for the first time since the guns came out. Before you decide what happens to me, he said evenly. You should understand what happens if I don't walk out of here. Luciano looked up slowly. Bumpy leaned forward now, not aggressively, but deliberately. That paper, he continued, is one of several. Some are already in motion. Some are waiting. He paused. If I disappear tonight, those names start talking by morning. No threat followed. None was needed. The brilliance of the move wasn't the information itself, it was the structure around it. Bumpy wasn't claiming power. He was demonstrating inevitability. Killing him wouldn't erase the problem. It would multiply it. Luciano understood that instantly. This wasn't a gangster play. It was an insurance policy. And it revealed something the Mafia had underestimated. Bumpy Johnson wasn't surviving because the Italians allowed it. He was surviving because he had woven himself into the city so deeply that removing him would collapse more than it fixed. For the first time in the meeting, Luciano shifted uncomfortably. The guns were still raised. But now they felt irrelevant. Because Bumpy Johnson had changed the terms completely. This was no longer a test of intimidation. It was a lesson in consequence. And Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful men in America, realized he was no longer the only one in the room who understood how the game was really played. Silence is never empty. In rooms where power gathers, silence is where decisions are made. After the paper was read, no one spoke. The man holding it slowly folded it back along the creases, his fingers no longer steady. The gun in his other hand dipped slightly, not by order, not by fear alone, but by instinct. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it at the same time. Lucky Luciano raised his hand. Not sharply. Not urgently. Just enough. The guns lowered. No one holstered them yet. That would have been too obvious, too much of an admission. But the threat had dissolved. What remained was calculation. Luciano leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He didn't look angry. Anger was useless now. What crossed his face instead was recognition, the look of a man who realizes the board is bigger than he thought. Bumpy Johnson watched him closely. This was the most dangerous part. When guns come out, intentions are clear. But when they go down, men start thinking. And men like Lucky Luciano were most lethal when they were thinking. Luciano broke the silence at last. "You've been busy," he said. Bumpy nodded once. "You forced me to be." The words weren't an insult. They were a statement of fact. Luciano tapped the table lightly, once, twice, considering. Killing Bumpy now would be easier than letting this stand. But easy didn't mean smart. The information on that paper wasn't just leverage, it was a warning. Harlem wasn't a loose end. It was tied into the same machinery that kept Luciano powerful. And that machinery didn't forgive disruption. Luciano looked around the room at his men. Loyal. Dangerous. Efficient. But not irreplaceable. He looked back at Bumpy. Irreplaceable. That was the difference. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, not pressing, not retreating, meeting Luciano where he was. "You don't want Harlem burning," Bumpy said quietly. "And I don't want your world watching mine." The genius of the moment was its restraint. Bumpy wasn't demanding territory. He wasn't threatening war. He was offering stability on his terms. Luciano understood that too. Finally, Lucky stood. The room tensed again, but this time for a different reason. This wasn't escalation. It was closure. "So," Luciano said slowly, smoothing his jacket. "We understand each other." It wasn't a question. Bumpy rose as well. "We always did." They held each other's gaze for a long moment. No smiles. No handshake. Just acknowledgement, the kind exchanged between men who know exactly what the other is capable of. Luciano turned to his men. "Put them away." The guns disappeared. Just like that. No drama. No aftermath. Just the quiet finality of a decision that would ripple through New York's underworld for years. As Bumpy walked toward the door, no one stopped him. No one followed. The meeting was over. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of how close it had come to chaos. Inside that room, Lucky Luciano sat back down, staring at the empty chair across from him, understanding one hard truth. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man you intimidated. He was a man you negotiated with or paid for later. And from that day forward, the Mafia never again tried to put guns on him. Because silence, when earned, is louder than fear. The meeting ended without blood, but its impact spread through New York like a quiet earthquake. No sirens. No headlines. No bodies in the street. Yet within days, the balance of power had subtly, permanently shifted. Those closest to Lucky Luciano noticed it first. Meetings involving Harlem changed tone. Demands became discussions. Orders softened into suggestions. The Mafia didn't withdraw, but it adjusted. And in the underworld, adjustment was admission. It meant someone had encountered a force that couldn't be crushed without consequence. That force was Bumpy Johnson. Word traveled the way it always did, indirectly. A comment here. A look there. A warning disguised as advice. Men understood that Harlem was no longer a pressure point. It was neutral ground under the protection of a man whose reach extended far beyond street corners. For the Italians, this wasn't defeat. It was survival. Luciano kept his empire intact by choosing which battles weren't worth winning. Harlem was one of them. Bumpy Johnson remained in place, not as a subordinate, but as a partner of necessity. The arrangement wasn't written, signed, or spoken aloud, but it was respected. And respect in that world was everything. In Harlem, the effect was immediate. Violence stayed low. Business flowed smoothly. Numbers ran without interruption. Police pressure eased just enough to notice. Bumpy's name carried even more weight, not because he bragged, but because he didn't need to. Young men whispered about the meeting like it was legend. Some exaggerated it. Some stripped it down to its simplest truth. But the lesson survived every retelling. Bumpy Johnson faced guns and didn't blink. That mattered. It told Harlem's people something powerful, that their leader wasn't protected by the Mafia. He stood as an equal. That knowledge built loyalty stronger than fear ever could. Bumpy himself never referenced the standoff again. He didn't capitalize on it. Didn't use it as a threat. He continued as he always had, measured, calm, deliberate. That consistency reinforced the message better than any speech. As for Lucky Luciano, he never challenged Bumpy directly again. Others might test the boundary. Some always did. But the core leadership understood the cost. And the cost wasn't war. It was exposure. Bumpy Johnson had made himself indispensable to the system that tried to intimidate him. Killing him would unravel more than it solved. In a world built on secrecy, that was the ultimate protection. Years later, when people asked how a black man ruled Harlem while the Mafia ruled New York, the answer wasn't violence or luck. It was intelligence. It was patience. It was the ability to stand unarmed in front of guns and force the men holding them to reconsider their own power. Bumpy Johnson didn't defeat Lucky Luciano. He did something far more dangerous. He made him back down. And in the underworld, where reputation lived longer than men, that moment became permanent. Not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable.